Before we even get started, let's talk fabric. The Willo Pattern has a lot of suggested fabrics. Fabrics like gabardine, crepe, georgette, poplin, voile, chambray tencel twill, cotton lawn, challis, linen, lightweight suitings, and 4-ounce twill blends are all great starting points. I chose this mystery linen-like mint fabric to make my romper today. It has a touch of stretchy give, but not a ton. Generally, when I'm looking for a great fabric, I am looking for a woven fabric that has some structure, but also really great drape. Stretch fabrics are totally fine for the Willo. Just realize that this pattern is drafted with positive ease, so you may want to adjust your sizing if your fabric has significant stretch, like over 30%. For the blouse, I have this crinkle textured fabric that is somewhere between a crepe and a georgette. This is pretty lightweight and a little translucent, which is fine for the blouse. Of course, if you are making the romper or jumpsuit, you'll want a fabric that isn't too sheer. In the instructions included in the pattern, I list all the pieces you need to cut for each style. But if there was any doubt, they are listed right there on the screen too. A lot of the sewing instructions are similar for each Willo style, so I've grouped them together just like the pattern instructions. The all views section is just what it sounds like. Everyone should follow along. But then I will break it out for views A and B, and then view C. At the end of the video, I list some hem options, as well as adding closures. Time for the pregame. To get your pregame started, you'll need to cut out and adhere some interfacing. I have my collar and undercollar pieces here, and you'll notice that I only use interfacing on just the undercollar. I like to do this because it keeps my collar from being too stiff. But if you want a collar with more body, or you are using a really thin fabric, you can interface both. I also interface both my collar facings. Once I adhere the interfacing on, I also press the collar facing along the fold line, which is listed on the pattern piece. While this isn't necessary, I think it makes the process easier when we get to installing this into our garment. All right, we are prepped and ready to get this sewing party started. First up, grab the lower back piece. This piece was cut along the fold, so open it up if you need to and refold it, matching right sides together. Locate the notch along the top. At the notch, stitch down about 1 inch. I finished stitching the pleat, then I hopped over to my iron and pressed this pleat open, creating a box pleat. Next, I'm grabbing my back yoke, open it up, placing the bottom edge of the yoke to the top edge of the lower back, right sides together. Now, stitch across. I stitched the seam and then I added some serging as a seam finish. There are other ways of finishing a seam off, like a zigzag stitch or using pinking shears. All of these I go through in more depth in the pattern. After I finish the seam, I add some edge stitching along the back yoke. This is totally optional, but just keeps things in place after washing and wearing. Time to grab the side front pieces. You should have cut 2. Take a peek and notice that there are some notches at the waistline of the pattern piece. We are going to be matching these notches by folding this in half lengthwise. Then, once we are at the machine, we will stitch from the notch down the long edge and then stitch along the short edge. Then repeat for the other side front. We have done the stitching for these waist ties, but before we turn them, let's clip along the short end and the corner so it's not too bulky in there. We also need to clip again at the notches. This time we want to clip all the way, but not through the stitching. For some camera magic, I took my other side front and went ahead and turned the tie right side out and gave it all a press. Trimming this end allows for the corners to be fully pushed outward when pressed. Also, I only pressed this tie up to where it's even with the notches. Any higher will press into the ease of the blouse and leave a crease. Now, notice that clipping fully into the notches allows for the raw edges to join together. This is going to be our waist seam, so we want to make sure this is laying as flat as possible. It's time to get our fronts and back together. It's pretty simple. We just need to match right sides together along the shoulder and side seams and stitch. Then repeat for the other side. Just like I did along my back piece, I will add seam finishing to all these seams. Setting our bodice to the side, we are going to switch over to working on the sleeves. Checking out the 2 fold lines listed on the pattern, we will be using them as a guide at the next step. But first, we need to fold them in half, right sides together, and stitch along the sleeve seam. Now I have the sleeves stitched up, and it's also important to note that, again, I added some seam finishing here as well. So yeah, I obviously like to flip things around from right side to wrong side out here, but I actually think it's easier to press this next step with the sleeve inside out. To start the cuff, fold up the raw edge of the hem about 2 inches and press around. Then in the same direction, fold it again another 2 inches and press around. After pressing the sleeves, edge stitch around the folded edge at 1/4 of an inch, creating the tuck detail. Here I went ahead and pre-pressed my sleeve and it's ready to add the edge stitching. All right, I've edge stitched around both my sleeves. To finish them off, we are going to be pulling down that folded flap, creating the hem, and then we want to fold up the tuck. Then you'll want to press everything into place. Here I have the second sleeve already pressed the way it should be. Time to get the sleeve into the bodice. This sleeve does not have a front or a back, but there is a notch on the sleeve's cap. Basically, it's there so you know where to match at the shoulder seam. I always start with matching the sleeve seam to the side seam, then matching the notch to the shoulder seam. Then I stitch in my sleeve. Well, the sleeves are in and looking fantastic. Just like a few steps before, I did add some seam finishing to my armhole as well. Let's get cracking on the collar. Hopefully you pre-gamed and already have your interfacing on. Otherwise, get on that. Again, I only interface my undercollar, but if you want more structure, you can totally interface both pieces. Place the undercollar on top of the collar, matching along the straight, long edge, and stitch across. Then open up the collar pieces and understitch along the undercollar's edge. Well, we've stitched and understitched the top edge of the collar. Just remember, understitching allows for a seam to roll backwards, so your seam allowance should be pushed towards the undercollar. Flip the collar pieces back around so they are once again right sides together. Now, along the short edges, stitch each side of the collar. I've stitched the short edges of the collar, then turned it right side out and gave everything a press. I made sure to clip the corners of my collar so that the corners turned better. After all of that, we are going to attach the collar now to the bodice. You should have clipped notches that lay along the neckline. If not, you can find them on your pattern. This is where the edges of the collar will start and stop. Place the collar along the neckline. The undercollar should be facing the right side of your bodice. Starting at one notch, stitch around, landing the other collar's edge at the other notch. Last little step in completing this top bodice half is going to be adding some stay stitching along the bottom edge of the back bodice. We are adding this here because there is some ease built into the back bodice that is bigger than the bottom half, and we need to take it in just slightly. Here we are! Whether you are making the romper or the jumpsuit, these instructions are the same. You should have cut out 2 fronts and 2 backs of either the shorts or the pants. And since it's pretty hard to show pants on camera, I'm opting for the shorts today. Starting off, we will stitch up the crotch seams first. So with right sides together, place the backs together, then stitch. Now, looking at the front, there is this cutout that indicates the start of the front crotch. Starting at the top of the cutout area, stitch the front crotch seam all the way down. The other half will be for inserting the button extension later. All right, I've stitched up the crotch seams and also added seam finishing. I highly recommend reinforcing this seam as it tends to be under stress with wear. I mean, who wants to split their pants in public? In the same spirit, I did the front crotch seam too. The seam allowance should sit just on the outside of the cutout. As you can see, this leaves about a 1/4 inch gap, which will be coming into play when we put in the button extension. But hey, we aren't there yet. So check out those notches on the top of the front pattern piece. Fold the outer notch to match the inner notch and pin into place. Once at your machine, baste across to secure them into place. Check them out. Here's the front pleats once they're basted. Let's move on to inserting the pockets. You should have cut 4 pieces total. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now grab 2 opposite pocket pieces. Hopefully you clipped at the notches of the pocket because you'll need them to match up to the fronts. Working with 1 pocket at a time, place it along the side seam of the front, matching at the notches with right sides together. Now stitch just between the notches. And then, of course, repeat for the other side. Here we have it. We have stitched on the pockets between the notches. At those notches, clip into the seam all the way, but not through the stitching. For this next step, we will want to hop on over to the iron. Folding the pocket to the wrong side, press just between the notches along that stitched area. Then you'll want to allow the area beyond the notches to stay facing outward and leaving a raw edge. After pressing, edge stitch along the seam at a 1/4 inch. Now you can see this is slowly becoming our pocket opening. But before we get there, we gotta stitch the back pocket on. Place another pocket piece on top of the stitched on pocket, right sides together. Stitching through just the pocket pieces, stitch around the curved edge of the pocket. I've got the pocket sewn together and I also added some seam finishing. Laying the pocket area flat, notice that notched in pocket opening and the raw edges of the side seam. So now I'm gonna lay my back piece on top of my front, right sides together. We wanna stitch the side seams, but only catching the raw edges. I wanna make sure I'm paying close attention not to stitch through the pocket opening we just made. I've stitched the side seams and then added some seam finishing as well. You know you did it correctly when you take a look and you've only sewn just over the corners of the pocket opening. See, my hand fits through. So we haven't gotten to the hem options yet, but I do plan to make the split hem. So I stopped stitching at my side seam about 3 inches above the raw edge and then clipped all the way to the stitching where I stopped. For a standard hem, you can sew the entire length of the side seam. Of course, while I was at the machine stitching away at my side seams, it was total habit to do my inseams as well. All I did was match my inseam at the crotch, right sides together, and then stitched the entire seam. Oh my goodness, we have finally made it to the point of attaching the bottom half to the top half. Remember, you needed to add stay stitching along the back bodice. Chances are you'll need to slightly gather this. It's roughly 2 inches, but it does range depending on the size you're making. Once it's been gathered enough, we can place the bottom half to the top half, right sides together. I like to start by matching both pieces at the side seams and placing a pin. Next, I place a pin along the center back seam. When matching the front point, the edge of the pleat on the bottom half should match up to the waist tie of the top half. Make sure when stitching the waist seam, you sew just slightly beyond the clipped area, as well as pushing the ties out of the way so you don't sew through them. I also like to pin the pocket into place on both sides. You'll notice there's just a hint of ease on the top half at the front. It's not a ton that requires stay stitching, but it's easy enough to ease while sewing. The ease along the top half of the waist seam actually is what gives it that blousey feel, while the bottom half has a bit more fitted waist feel. Okay, now it's time to stitch the entire waist seam. Here we have it, makers. The entire piece is finally attached and it's really shaping up. Check out those waist ties. I've attached both the top and bottom pieces together of my romper. Then I serged the seam allowance. It's time to start prepping for the button extension. To do that, I like to add narrow stay stitching down at the bottom where those pesky little corners will be. So check it out. Using a narrow stitch, I stitched around the bottom of this opening just inside the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I stopped about 1 inch above. Before I move on to the next step, I want to clip into the corners of the stitched box area. You want to clip all the way to, but not through that stitching. This stitching really helps keep the structure square while sewing the next few steps. It can get messy and sometimes hard to judge the seam allowance, so this will help. With that little bit of prep done, we can start placing the collar facing pieces along the front opening, right sides together. There will be a notch along the facing that indicates matching at the waist, and then the collar facing should extend approximately a 1/2 inch beyond that clipped box at the bottom. When stitching this all together, stop right at that stitching. Sewing beyond it will cause your corners to be a little wonky. The collar facings are attached. I added some seam finishing to the outside edge of the facing. This will be left exposed, so you'll want some kind of finishing there, and I also pressed all my facing seams. Now it's time to choose a side you want your garment to close on. Traditionally, it's right over left for women's and left over right for menswear, but screw gender norms. I rarely pay attention to the side I'm choosing, so I think you should pick the side that makes you feel awesome. Okay, check out the bottom of the button extension. You should just have a small triangle piece for the bottom. Now place one collar facing over the other, matching the edge of the triangle piece to your facing pieces. Then stitch along that line of stay stitching, sewing only from corner to corner. All right, let's see that one more time in slow motion. I know it's a little tricky. Using this narrow stitching in the corners really helps the structure of the fabric here. I actually do this every time I'm sewing into a corner. If you've ever made the madcap jacket, you would have seen this done too. Also, be super mindful that stopping and starting right at that stay stitching really helps making crisp corners. Hey, this button extension is killing it. Take a peek inside. I also have added some seam finishing along the bottom edge. That narrow stay stitching helped these corners not get stretched out, and with knowing exactly where to stop and start our stitching. Next up, we need to head up to the top of the collar facing. Folding back along the pressed fold line, we are going to stitch this length of the facing, keeping the collar tucked in between. When we get over here to the edge of the facing at the shoulder, we want to tuck back the facing by a ½ inch and then continue stitching over the seam. This will make a clean finish at the shoulder later on. The top part of the facing is stitched. Notice the turn back edge of the shoulder? I'm going to flip this right side out and push out the corners, then give everything a press. I didn't need to do any clipping on this, but sometimes you might need to clip into the seam if it's not laying flat. Later on, we will be stitching down this edge of the collar facing, but we need to get through the next few steps first. All right, so I know you were secretly panicking about this raw collar edge, but don't worry, we are going to take care of that now. Snag a piece of ribbon or binding. You can create one out of fabric or use a piece of ribbon like I am here. Either way, you want a finished width to be approximately a ½ inch wide. Lining the ribbon a few inches beyond the shoulder seam at the existing seam line, stitch down the length of the ribbon along the existing seam, stopping approximately at the same length past the other shoulder. With the top line of the ribbon stitched on, I found I needed to trim off some of my seam allowance. With the seam allowance trimmed, it will now sit inside the ribbon. We are going to fold this ribbon down along the inside of the garment and sew along the opposite edge, stopping right at the shoulder seams. Sewing past the shoulder seams means it will show on the front of your garment, which is less than ideal. And here it is. I've stitched down the ribbon binding, stopping just at the shoulder seams. Now it's time to stitch down these flaps of the shoulder facing. Can't leave them flapping in the wind. Laying them flat, we want to stitch in the ditch of the shoulder seam. Flipping over to the other side, here you can see what it looks like when it's finished. You totally can hand stitch this down if you prefer, but I hate hand stitching. To keep the collar facing from flapping around, we want to add some stitching around the button extension. Taking a peek at the pattern piece, notice that there's a top notch along the long edge. Starting and stopping at this notch point, you can either stitch in the ditch or edge stitch around the button extension. Going beyond the notch points will show on the lapel when the collar folds out. Okay makers, we are going to get started on the second half of View C, or the blouse. You should have watched the all views portion of this video first, which included the directions for making the top half of the willow. If you skipped ahead and just came here instead, you'll want to hop back towards the beginning to get the details. With the top half completed, we are starting with the bottom half of the willow. Pick up the shirt side fronts, laying them right sides up, fold the outer notch over to meet the inner notch. Pinning them into place, we will then baste over to secure them into place. Pleats are basted in. Next, we are going to grab the shirt side back, opening it up and placing it right sides together along the side seams. And then at the machine, stitch up both side seams. Side seams are stitched, and I also added some seam finishing too. While I was at the machine, I also added my hem finishing. Unlike the romper and jumpsuit, we want to finish the hem before we move on to anything else. I just used a 1/4 inch double turn hem. This is easily accomplished with a hemming foot or by turning a 1/4 inch up towards the wrong side twice and stitching. Okay, next we are going to connect the top and bottom halves together. I like to start with matching both pieces at the side seams. Then match approximately at the center back. Remember, you may need to gather the back bodice slightly so they match. Next, we want to match along the front, at the tie, and the pleat. Make sure you are fully clipped into the seam at the top of the tie so that it all lays flat. After matching the tie and pleat, notice there's just a subtle ease along the bodice front. It's just a little and can be eased while sewing. With everything matched up, we can stitch the entire length of the waist seam. All right, we have the waist seam stitched, and I also added seam finishing. Then I pressed the seam. Here's what the tie and pleat area look like when it's sewn. Make sure you stitch this area well so there's no gapping. Next, we are moving on to the collar facing. You should have pre-gamed these pieces by adhering interfacing to both pieces and then pressing along the fold line. There's a lower notch along the long line of the collar facing. This indicates where the facing should match up with the waist seam. Now line up that long edge of the collar facing right sides together with the front of the blouse. Use that waist notch to help make sure things are lining up correctly. The bottom edge of the collar facing should hang past the blouse's hem by about a ½ inch. Now stitch both collar facings onto the blouse. Both facings have been stitched on. I went ahead and pressed the seam and repressed that fold line. I also added seam finishing to the outer edge of the collar facing. Looking down at the bottom hem, we need to finish off the extension. Folding back along the fold line, we want to stitch right at the finished hemline. Once we've stitched the ends of both extensions, flip them right side out, pushing out the corners. The extra width of the collar facing should naturally tuck up, but we want to stitch this down to secure it. Moving our way up to the top of the collar facing, fold back the facing along the fold line and match it along the neckline, keeping the collar tucked in between. We will stitch along this neckline seam, but before stitching over the shoulder seam, tuck back the edge about a ½ inch and then stitch over. The top collar area is all stitched, and we want to flip this right side out. Feel free to clip along the seam allowance if things aren't laying flat for you. And then once everything's flipped right side out, we want to give this entire collar area a press. On to finishing this collar area. We are going to cover this raw edge using a binding or a ribbon. I have this velvet ribbon that matches almost perfectly, so that's what I'll be using. But you can make your own ½ inch binding if you wish. Line the top edge of the ribbon just a bit past the shoulders along the existing seam line. Then stitch the length of the ribbon just through the seam allowance, starting and stopping just past the shoulder seams. The top of the ribbon is stitched on, but I need to trim the edge of my seam allowance so that it's sitting inside my ribbon. Once it's all trimmed, we will need to stitch the bottom edge of the ribbon, stopping and starting now right at the shoulder seam. Going beyond the shoulder seam will show on the front of our garment, which isn't the look we're going for. The ribbon is stitched down, which completely encloses the raw edge of the collar. Time to tack down the flap of the facing at the shoulder. Line the edge of the facing to the shoulder seam, then stitch in the ditch at the seam. This is invisible from the outside, but is visible from the inside. If you prefer to hand stitch this, go ahead. I just hate hand stitching. Last bit to keeping the facing in place is to add some stitching along the front. You can either edge stitch or stitch in the ditch depending on the look you want. It's important to start the stitching at the top notch along the edge of the collar facing. This way it doesn't show on the lapel of your collar when flipped open. Adding the back elastic casing is the same regardless of what willow you are making. Grab the elastic casing. I already pressed mine, but you'll want to fold down and press all the edges by a 1/2 inch. Find the center of the casing by folding it in half, then placing that midpoint at the center of the garment's back, straddling the waist seam. Then stitch along both long edges of the casing. The long edges have been stitched down, and now it's time to add the elastic. Listed on the elastic casing pattern piece is the length of elastic needed based on your size. Cut a piece of 1 to 1 1/4 wide elastic the desired length. Using a safety pin or tool of your choice, begin guiding the elastic through the casing. When the elastic reaches the end, pin it into place. Continue to pull the other end of the elastic through to the end of the casing and then pin. At the machine, add 2 rows of stitching, one right at the edge of the casing to close it, the second about a 1/4 inch over, making sure the elastic is secured inside. Let's back that hem up, makers. There's a few options whether or not you're doing the romper or jumpsuit. One is using the same technique as the sleeves faux cuff. And if that's what you're aiming for, hop on back and rewatch those steps in the all views portion, as it's done exactly the same. I'm opting for the double turned wide hem that features the bound split hem option. To include the split hem, the side seam should stop about 3.5 inches above the raw edge. If you didn't plan ahead, don't sweat. You can just unstitch that 3.5 inches. You will also need a piece of ribbon or binding that's approximately 6 inches long. If you unstitched, add some back stitching, then clip into the seam allowance all the way to, but not through the stitching. First things first, we need to complete our double turn hem. Press the raw edge up by 1/2 inch toward the wrong side, and then again by 1 inch. Then just stitch around the entire leg opening at the top edge of the fold. The double turned hems are completed, and we left the side seams open for the split hem. Turning the garment wrong side out, head over to one of the openings. Place the center of the piece of ribbon just above the opening at the stitching. Next, stitch the ribbon into place at the existing stitch line. With the ribbon attached, we will flip up the top layer showing the right side of the fabric. Fold over the ribbon so that the ribbon is right side up and creating this 45-degree angle at the top. Stitch down the interior line of the ribbon, avoiding the folded back area. This line of stitching should follow the existing line of stitching. Moving on, flip to the other side of the opening. Once again, looking at the right side of the fabric, fold down the ribbon and stitch the inner edge of the ribbon, stitching just next to the line of stitching and avoiding the other side of the opening. Here we have the ribbon stitched on. Next, we're going to wrap the split hem up, laying the flat area, press out the ribbon so that it's folding back the seam allowance. Starting at one side, stitch the outer edge of the ribbon. pivoting around the corners at the top and then stitching the other side. When stitching, tuck under the extra ribbon, leaving a clean finish. And here it is, all finished. The very last thing to do is to add some top stitching across from pivot point to point. This adds some strength to this seam and avoids ripping, because you know you're going to wear this garment out because she's just that awesome. Let's close this baby up and add some closures to your Willow. It doesn't matter if you're team snaps or team buttons, you'll need to mark where they go. Included within the pattern is a button placement piece. That should fit the size of the finished button extension. You may want to add more or less closures, and that's totally cool. But whatever you do not skip the one right here at the waist. It's very important at keeping things closed. With a marking tool of choice, it'll be pins for me today. Lay the button placement on top of the extension. I'm just quickly pinning the center of each marking. If you are putting in buttons, realize this should be the center of your buttonhole, not the top or bottom. Continue until you have all the markings done, and then repeat for the other side. I like to leave this second side loose and then compare them to the first side and make sure everything is lining up properly. Then I'll add my snaps because #team snaps. Ta-da! Check these out. I just love the little details we added. I have to say, these willows are ready for action. Now where to wear them. Thanks, makers, for sewing with me today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and making the Willow pattern. So with you next time.